thought I would talk about today, given the opportunity, is what I'm thinking about as the conceptual architecture of data sustainability. And by this, I mean, what are the, if you want, conceptual, theoretical, intellectual, semantic foundations that are being incorporated into the ways in which we organize data infrastructures, and what implications do they have for the sustainability of data and, in fact, for life on the planet and planetary health. So my hope is that this is a slightly different take, in a sense, from some of what the other speakers have been doing. I'm coming from a more philosophical perspective, a philosopher of science, and I do a lot of empirical work also, as I've been doing with many collaborators, especially in the crop science space over the last few years. I'm now leading a project on the philosophy of open science, which I think has connections to what we're talking about today. Anyhow, let me just, oh yeah, there you go. So I want to just start with a few quick thoughts, what we may mean by the environmental sustainability of data work. Clearly, there's been a lot of discussion already in this series about the environmental sustainability of data centers, of the use of analytics, and this is creating all sorts of very severe issues in terms of, potential pollution, in terms of energy consumption for research and for the planet. And I want to look at a slightly different, though related aspect, and that is the ways in which actually organizing data in particular ways actually can bring environmental risks itself. And this is particularly when one takes account of the fact that these rhetorics of data being not only infinitely reusable, but actually being infinitely repurposed. So being available for any possible purpose when they're put online is still very present, I think, in data conversations and data work. And I think, in my view, deeply wrong. And I'm going to try and exemplify what I mean by this. So I want to talk about data semantics and the implications of the semantics we use to structure data online for environmental interventions. And I think this is really an important concern to have when thinking about the environmental sustainability of data work. I will use examples for crop data science, as I said, partly because indeed I've just completed a large project on this, and I continue to do a lot of work in this area. But I think many of the considerations also apply to other areas of scientific research where a lot of data are being used, also both produced by research, but also coming from other parts of society, for instance, marine science and environmental science also. And of course, biomedicine and epidemiology. Right, so what can we say very briefly about this question of data intensity and data linkage in agronomic research? People have been aware since a long, long time, well before the advent of mass computation, that when we're thinking about, evidence-based agricultural development, we are looking at a very complex landscape, which has a lot of different types of evidence that underpins it, lots of different types of data. And at the very least, since the 1950s, there's been a lot of efforts internationally to try and think about how on earth do we bring together different kinds of data we need to try and document anything to do with food production and agriculture and the use of land, and how this may in fact speak to questions, emerging questions around pollution and in fact climate change. And I think this search for how structures that allow us to integrate this very diverse data had intensified with the rise, of course, of data-intensive technologies and infrastructures. Now we are looking at data integration around plants and crops to do all sorts of things, from predicting, of course, yields and the performance of certain crops, to monitoring the spread of pests and detect disease, trying to understand different stresses that plants may come under that may have implications for how the humans use those plants, think about diversity and how do we conserve types of plant diversity that are particularly important in terms of life on the planet and also human life, and so on and so forth. And in fact, this means also trying to link this data not just around the world, across different locations, across different crops and different dimensions of their biology, but also with wider environmental, climate and health data and socioeconomic data that may be able to tell a story or allow us to tell a story about what is going on in a particular territory that is relevant to agriculture. And what has also become particularly obvious in the last 2 decades is that agriculture, and particularly yield-intensive agriculture and monocultures, are among the most important factors and causes of climate change. And this is not just because of the, say, gas emissions that are involved in the production of food systems. And here you have a little graph that summarizes some of those issues and how much worse those emissions have gotten over the last 20 years. But it's also because the ways in which we manage food production and the production of plants that feed other parts of our economy, like clothing, for instance, in case of cotton and so, actually have strong intersections with all the rest of the economic system on the planet. The way in which we manage land in different ways, conservation, water management, energy management, and so on and so forth. And so if you take all of those factors together, then agriculture becomes a really decisive factor in the fight against climate change. Now, within this landscape, of course, we have a very strong push to collect and share data of all types. Particularly, there's lots of interest in what are now called phenotypic data, so data that document, for instance, through imaging, the morphology of plants, the root development of leaves, remote sensing with satellites and drones that they document the canopy and see how different cultivations are actually faring around the world, but also information that comes directly from farmers, from breeders, and from people who are involved or have been involved in creating knowledge and cultures around plants. And this is very often happening through very highly commercialized technologies. So many agricultural tools at the moment, including tractors, for instance, have really been transformed into data collecting vehicles that then sort of privatize that data for use of the company that provides these kinds of instruments. Of course, there's very heavy dependence of cloud services like Amazon to store the data. And there's all sorts of technologies involved in collecting the data, ranging from satellites to smart robots and smart glasshouses that are employed in this field. One of the key players that I'm working with in the field is the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. This is a very large organization consisting of many different institutes spread around the world, that's existed since 1971, and officially at least, and it's very explicitly dedicated to cultivating plant diversity for the resource poor. So it's very much looking at agricultural development for the global south, and as a lot of stuff, and is really one of the main research organizations devoted to collecting and analyzing data on crops for the purpose of trying to improve the ways in which we produce, we cultivate plants and produce food and other type of materials that we use in human societies. And here is just an exemplification of one exercise on the latest forms of these efforts to try and link data, store data, collect data, that is sponsored by the CGIAR, which is called the One CGIAR. They're trying to bring together all the different data collections happening at the different institutes around the world that are part of this organization. And as you can see here, I hope you can see it on your screen, but it's just to give you a sense of just how wide this enterprise is. The fact that there are so many different types of data involved, ranging from policy related to socioeconomic to, of course, data about the plants, and many, many organizations involved, including a lot of private companies. So there's a sense in which one of the key issues, and has been a key issue for like decades now in this type of enterprise, is to try and encourage a more inclusive data governance. Why is this? Because, you know, of course, people want to try and assemble multidisciplinary teams with a variety of stakeholders, try and provide standards and reference points for data collection that makes it easier for people to exchange information, provide as much as possible centralized infrastructure that is accessible to everybody, also very much in the spirit of open science. And this is partly linked to the concern around the fact, also very well recognized, that many of the people who engage in plant breeding and farming and related data sharing tend not to be recognized for their contributions and are not really consulted when data are used or interpreted. So farmers may be asked to donate data from their fields to document the ways in which their plants are growing, but they're not really brought into the interpretation of that data. And this is a situation which, to put it philosophically, is rife with injustice, and a particular kind of injustice, which in philosophy we tend to talk about as epistemic injustice. So an injustice which has to do with the ways in which we think about and produce knowledge and use knowledge. And this results potentially also in unreliable biological knowledge, because you don't have good enough representation of different perspectives and different types of expertise in making sense of this data. And so the idea has been, let's try and bring in more people into these efforts, more perspectives, more participants, so that we can have a variety of perspectives on what counts of biological knowledge here. And hopefully this will help us to build more sustainable frameworks for agricultural development. And one of the efforts I've been looking at in doing this kind of work together with many of these different stakeholders internationally is an effort called the crop ontology. This is an effort to organize data, and particularly data about plant traits, in a way that actually makes it possible for people who are doing experiments and observations on these plants in different parts of the world to actually bring together their knowledge, collect their data, pull them together, and then try and make comparison across what is happening in different parts of the world. And this is an initiative which is very much transnational. In fact, these kind of data semantics initiatives are almost acting as data brokers. That's something I've been defending in my work. They're trying and include multiple stakeholders. They're trying to develop participatory practices for crop data collection and management, involving local breeders and farmers, developing protocols particularly for diminishing gender inequity in the decisions around crop cultivation, resisting privatization, being very committed to open science. Try also to mediate between different types of data infrastructures used in this space, very local and also international, for instance, like those run by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and also try and mediate a lot of the tension that arise from trying to link these very local situations with global networks. At the same time, what we keep seeing is that these efforts that you would think are really important, very significant and very urgent to try and bring in these different perspectives, being over-determined, if you want, by the overarching political economy that underpins the use of data to feed new interventions into agricultural development. So there's a sense in which we may be successful in bringing in many more participants, particularly from the global south, into these exercises. But there's still questions around, in fact, how much is data use something which is still the preserve of people who have the resources, the money, and the power to transform data into knowledge. There is a sense that, in fact, people who benefit the most from having all this data now accessible online and pulled together keep being researchers and companies which are based in the global north. There's still a sense in which many of the contributors don't really retain control or ownership of the data that they put into the system. There's a lot of discussion, the Convention for Biological Diversity, among many other organizations, around how this may in fact work, but there still really isn't a resolution that is workable. And the ways in which data get commodified and absorbed by, particularly big agro-businesses and transformed into products, different kinds of fertilizers, different new lines of seeds and crop varieties, the ways in which this is all commodified is unchallenged. So there's no real discussion in, the situations where we're trying to pull data together about who then will have the right to commercialize this data and the information that is extracted from the data and how this may happen. And the problem is also that all of this enterprise is laden with commitments to high yield agriculture. So initially, this many of the people who participate in these exercises are motivated by the idea that if we learn more about how plants develop around the world, we may in fact be able to diversify our crops to respond to climate change in ways that are sensible. But the problem is that by the time these research results get commercialized, in fact, there is a strong tendency to, again, go back to focusing on what could be the new commercially viable hybrids and how do we make sure that we have still monocultures that may be more precise, so they're better targeted to particular environments, but are still commercialized and controlled by particular businesses in ways that can be unjust and unequal. And there tends to be, in fact, a dismissal altogether of so-called subsistence agriculture, so very much local agriculture geared towards the sustenance of local communities, partly because this environment fit this very high-tech model in which we are producing agricultural insights on the basis of very intensive data technologies. And so you get situations like, in the different places in the world I work with, like in the International Tropical Agriculture Institute in Lagos here, just over, in Ibadan, close to Lagos in Nigeria, where the data that are being sent out from these places are sent to all sorts of different organizations in the world, some of which are publicly sponsored and many of which are privately sponsored, and, whatever they then realize with the data is out of people's control. So the issue I see here, which hopefully is useful for us to discuss in relation to environmental sustainability, is this question about how do we address the regimes that we have in the world that are controlling knowledge. And here I'm using some of the terminology that Stephen Hillgarden has very usefully developed around this. And in particular, knowledge around agricultural development and related forms of justice or injustice. And the problem here is that the global system of data sourcing and circulation, which has many, many different contributors and is a very highly distributed expertise, remains under the knowledge control regime, which is exercised by agrotech businesses and increasingly data analytics companies. And this is being widely critiqued as unjust towards the local contributors, towards this knowledge landscape, the farmers, for instance, and also has been biased towards this more market-oriented view of how do we develop crops. The question is, when you put this situation together with the effort to try and make particularly open science and open data efforts in this space more inclusive, you get a situation where, if you want to be cynical, potentially you have a huge pooling of resources and knowledge into a system that becomes basically a sophisticated form of bioprospecting, where people are contributing their knowledge and information with the best intentions, but actually this is used by particular companies for their own interest, with very little accountability to the initial motivations and interests of the people that have contributed to this process. And I think this is really a different way of thinking about sustainability, but I think one that is also very important because it has obvious and immediate implications for how we, decisions that are taken about how land is managed and how crops are grown and what is actually happening in the world. So just, to give you a quick sense, and then I'll draw to a close because I want to leave time for discussion. This is a situation that is, inspired by, very, commendable dreams of a better agricultural development situation, trying to reimagine agriculture away from high-yield monocultures, try to find reliable standards for linking data and integrating knowledge, try, in fact, to challenge views that see ethnobotany or any kind of local knowledge by people who are dealing with plants since a long time, even if they're not professional scientists, as being completely irrelevant to scientific research. In fact, a lot of the research we're doing now in botany and in crop science indicates the fact that we need to get as much information as possible about the environments in which plants are grown, the ways in which they've been hybridized and developed and domesticated over the years and decades and centuries. And so lots of insights that come from these different types of local knowledges become very, very relevant to the development of plant science. At the same time, we have all these problems that continue. And we have the fact that this is all happening under a very colonial heredity of a situation where even what we mean by plant species and how we're thinking about the genetics of plants as a very strong colonial heritage. And some people talk about this as extractive epistemology. So just, thinking about biodiversity itself as something which is a resource for humans to exploit, rather than having different ways of thinking about the relationship between humans and nature. And so there is a constant, since a long time, well-established focus on elite breeds and monocultures, which in fact excludes farmer knowledge. There is a constant appeal towards the molecular bias. So even if we want to be interested in all sorts of different kinds of data, molecular data, genetic data, keep being rated more reliably as other types of data that may be produced with other types of technologies and by different types of experts. And so again, there is a sense in which people who don't have the facility to produce or analyze genetic data may be regarded as second-class contributors. And even when you look at the legal framings around, who may own different types of data, and in particular sequencing information, the focus really is on genetics rather than on other types of information around plants. There is a sense in which precision agriculture as an enterprise actually is not, to some extent, there can be a long discussion around whether this really amounts to a contextualized understanding of gene-environment interactions, rather than in fact being something that ends up being targeted to commercialization of particular crops in particular territories at particular times. Of course, all of those technologies are expanding the already enormous digital divide that exists in these fields between people who have access to and understand and can use and consult digital technologies and people who can't. There are huge surveillance concerns around what this means in terms of potentially using all of these tools to monitor farmer behavior and the characteristics of local communities in different countries. As I said, there's huge issues with benefit sharing. What would it mean to then recognize the work of people who are involved in all of this? And very often, even when these discussions are happening, they're happening in terms of financial compensation rather than in terms of thinking about whether, for instance, traditional communities or farming communities should participate in the governance of the data and the way in which they're actually being interpreted and used. And generally, we are under a regime of agricultural development that has a tendency to erase significant parts of cultural, biological, scientific, and semantic diversity from these data ecosystems. And we can talk about this more if you want. So I just want to end by pointing to the fact that the datification of plant science could potentially be told as two different kinds of stories, right? There is the story about trying to transform long-standing knowledge systems so that we can reimagine agricultural production in ways that really are conducive to remedying or trying to save the planet and improving planetary health. But it can also be seen as a story where what we're looking at is the increasing privatization of the process through which we get to know plants and make decisions about how the land should be cultivated, which have very, very different potential implications for the planet. And I just want to gesture, okay, sorry, I'm going to skip this because I don't want to take too long. But I want to gesture towards the fact that there's many different things that one can say about what one can try and solve this tension. And one of the things I'm interested in as a philosopher is in which ways, even the ways we conceptualize data in the first place is potentially supporting a certain way of exploiting data for the purpose of commercialization in this field. And so one of the things that I'm trying to recommend, and I've got a book that is trying to make the argument that's coming out soon, is to try and move away from the idea of data as something which is, the unavoidable starting point for knowledge development in the first place, the idea that we can just extract data and then insert them into algorithms and then get reliable knowledge, and rather try to focus much more on the histories of the data, the value-ladenness of data, the ways in which we in fact need a lot of contextual information to make sense of these data sets in ways that actually can really help us to save the planet and to create a green future. And with this, I'll stop and look forward to discussion. Thank you.